When my husband tried to take half my fortune in court, I let him. I remember the exact moment I made that decision, sitting alone in my kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, the sunlight barely touching the edge of the granite countertop we had picked out together 20 years ago, back when everything still felt like ours. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, just like the life I had spent decades building beside a man who now sat across from me in a courtroom, pretending he had built it all himself. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even correct him when his lawyer spoke about shared assets and joint effort. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and listened, the way I had learned to do over the years, quietly, patiently, watching. Because the truth was, Robert had always underestimated me. He thought my silence meant weakness. He thought my calm meant surrender. And most importantly, he believed every document he had signed, every account he had moved, every quiet little decision he had made behind my back had gone completely unnoticed. The courtroom that morning was exactly what you'd expect in a place like Westchester County. Polished wood, fluorescent lighting, a judge who looked like he had seen everything and was no longer impressed by much. Robert sat confidently in his tailored navy suit, his posture relaxed, his voice steady as he spoke through his attorney. He didn't look at me once. Not when he listed the properties. Not when he mentioned the investment accounts. Not even when he casually suggested that half of everything was only fair. I watched him the way you watch a stranger. Carefully, without emotion. Because the man sitting across from me was no longer the one who used to bring me flowers on a Tuesday for no reason, or the one who once promised, standing in our backyard under a string of cheap lights, that we would grow old together in that house. That man had disappeared somewhere between the late-night phone calls, the locked office doors, and the quiet shifts in bank statements I wasn't supposed to notice. And yet, even then, I said nothing. Not when I first suspected something was wrong. Not when I confirmed it. And certainly not now, when he was finally showing his hand in a room full of people who believed they were watching a simple divorce case unfold. Because what none of them knew, not the judge, not the attorneys, and definitely not Robert, was that I had already made my move long before either of them stepped into that courtroom. It had started with a single phone call 2 weeks earlier, one that came just after midnight, when the house felt too quiet and too large for one person. I remember staring at my phone as it rang, the name on the screen pulling me back into a part of my life I hadn't visited in years. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, something that had been waking up slowly, piece by piece, told me it was time. And when I finally picked up, everything began to change. So when the judge glanced in my direction that morning and asked if I had anything to add, I simply lifted my eyes, met his gaze, and said in the calmest voice I had used all day, "Not yet." Because I wasn't here to fight Robert. I was here to let him believe he had already won. The call had come at 12:17 in the morning, and I remember because I had been staring at the digital clock on my nightstand, watching the minutes pass like they had nowhere else to be, when the screen of my phone lit up in the dark. Daniel Brooks was not a name that belonged to my present life anymore. It belonged to a different time, a version of my marriage when finances were still something we discussed openly, when Robert still believed I needed to be included. Daniel had been our accountant for nearly 15 years, a quiet, meticulous man who noticed things most people overlooked. When I answered, there was no small talk, no polite introductions, just a pause on the line, and then his voice, steady but careful. He asked me a simple question. "Margaret, when was the last time you personally reviewed your financial statements?" I did not answer right away, because the truth was I could not remember. Not exactly. Somewhere along the years, I had let Robert take over. It had felt natural at the time. He said he enjoyed it. He said it made things easier. And I believed him. Daniel let the silence sit between us before continuing. He told me there were irregularities. Not dramatic ones. Not the kind that would raise alarms at a glance. But patterns. Transfers that did not align with our usual structure. Accounts that had been opened without my direct authorization. Entities I had never heard of quietly appearing in places where my name used to be. I sat up slowly in bed, the sheet falling to my waist as I tried to process what he was saying. I asked him if he was sure. He did not hesitate. He had double-checked everything. Triple-checked, actually. That was who he was. Careful. Thorough. Certain. And then he said something that settled into my chest in a way I could not ignore. I did not want to assume anything, but it looks like someone has been repositioning assets over time. Quietly. Strategically. Someone. He did not say Robert. He did not have to. I closed my eyes and let the words move through me, not like a shock, but like a confirmation. Because somewhere deep down, I think I had already known. The late nights, the locked office, the way conversations about money had slowly disappeared, replaced by vague reassurances and quick changes of subject. I had noticed. I had just chosen not to look too closely. Not until now. Daniel asked if I wanted him to send over a summary. I told him yes, and when the email arrived less than 10 minutes later, I opened it without hesitation. Page after page of numbers, accounts, timelines. It was all there, laid out with the kind of clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Robert had not made one move. He had made dozens. Small adjustments over months that turned into something much larger when you stepped back and looked at the whole picture. Money shifted into separate holdings. Properties transferred through layered ownership. Even a trust that had been modified in a way that removed my access entirely. I read everything once, then again, then a third time, slower, letting each detail settle into place. By the time I closed my laptop, the sky outside had begun to lighten, and something inside me had gone completely still. I did not call Robert. I did not confront him. I did not even mention it the next morning when he sat across from me at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone like nothing had changed. Instead, I poured my coffee, added a splash of cream, and asked him if he wanted more toast. He smiled, distracted, and said no. That was the moment I understood something clearly. This was not a mistake. This was not confusion. This was a plan. And if he had taken the time to build it so carefully, then I would take the time to understand it even better. Because I was not going to stop him. Not yet. I was going to let him continue. Let him believe everything was exactly as he wanted it to be. And then, when the time was right, I would decide what to do with everything he thought he had already taken. The next morning, I moved through the house the same way I always had, quietly, methodically, as if nothing had shifted beneath my feet. I made breakfast at exactly 7, just like I had for years, placing Robert's plate in front of him before he even had to ask. 2 eggs, over easy, toast lightly browned, coffee poured just the way he liked it. He did not look up when I set it down. His attention was fixed on his phone, his thumb scrolling in that distracted rhythm I had come to recognize over the past year. I watched him for a moment longer than usual, not searching for answers, but confirming what I already knew. There was no hesitation in him, no guilt, no sign that he believed anything had changed. And that told me everything I needed to understand about the role I had been playing in his plan. I sat down across from him and took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel intentional. He eventually glanced up, offering a brief smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You have court later this week, right?" he asked casually, as if he were discussing the weather. I nodded once. Thursday morning. He returned to his phone almost immediately, the conversation already finished in his mind. That was how it worked now. Short exchanges. No depth. No questions. It had been gradual, almost unnoticeable at first, but now it was impossible to ignore. After breakfast, I cleared the table and rinsed the dishes slowly, giving myself time to think without appearing like I was thinking at all. That had always been my strength. I did not react quickly. I observed. I listened. And when I finally acted, it was never without purpose. Later that afternoon, I sat in the small study at the back of the house, the one Robert rarely used anymore. It still held the original filing cabinets from when we first started building our business, long before things became complicated. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a folder I had not touched in years. Inside were documents I had insisted on keeping copies of, even when Robert said it was unnecessary. Old agreements, early investments, the foundation of everything we had built together. Or rather, everything I had built with him standing beside me. I placed the folder on the desk and opened my laptop, pulling up Daniel's email once again. This time, I did not just read it. I studied it. I matched dates, cross-referenced account numbers, traced movements that had once seemed insignificant but now formed a clear and deliberate pattern. It was not chaotic. It was precise. Robert had been careful, but he had also assumed I would never look closely enough to see what he was doing. That assumption was his first mistake. As the hours passed, the pieces began to settle into place in a way that felt almost quiet, almost calm. There was no surge of anger, no dramatic realization, just clarity, a steady understanding of what had been done, and more importantly, what had not been done. Because for all his planning, for all his quiet transfers and hidden adjustments, there were things he could not change without my direct involvement. Things he had overlooked. Things he believed were insignificant. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting that realization take shape. When I opened them again, I reached for my phone and scrolled to Daniel's number. I did not hesitate this time. When he answered, I spoke calmly, the same way I had in the courtroom, the same way I always did when something mattered. "I have a few questions," I said. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then his voice, steady as ever. "I thought you might." I turned my attention back to the documents in front of me, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "Tell me," I continued, "what he cannot move without me." The silence that followed was different this time. Not uncertain, not cautious, just deliberate. And when Daniel began to explain, slowly, clearly, outlining the structures that still required my authorization, I felt something shift into place with absolute certainty. Robert had spent months building a plan he believed was complete, but he had left one door unlocked, and I had just found the key. I did not respond immediately after that call. I let the information sit with me, the way you let a strong cup of coffee cool just enough before you take the first sip. Daniel had given me exactly what I needed, but more importantly, he had confirmed something I had begun to understand on my own. There were still pieces of our life that Robert could not touch without me, no matter how carefully he had tried to rearrange everything around them. And that meant one thing. He had not just underestimated me. He had relied on that underestimation to make his entire plan work. That afternoon, I drove to the bank for the first time in over a year. The same branch we had used since we first opened our business accounts, back when every deposit felt like a small victory and every dollar mattered. The building had not changed. The same glass doors, the same quiet lobby, the same manager behind the desk, though he looked a little older now, just like the rest of us. He recognized me immediately, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to something warmer, more familiar. "Mrs. Collins," he said, standing as I approached. "It has been a while." I smiled politely and nodded. "It has." I did not explain why. I did not need to. Instead, I asked if we could review a few accounts, specifically the ones that still required dual authorization. He paused for just a second, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, as if confirming the request in his mind. Then he nodded and gestured toward his office. Inside, the space felt smaller than I remembered, but that might have been because I was seeing it differently now, not as a place Robert managed, but as a place where my name still held weight. As we went through the records, one by one, I felt something settle into place with each confirmation. The signatures required, the structures that had not been altered, the protections that had been built into the system long before Robert decided to move things around quietly. He had worked around the edges, shifting what he could reach, but he had left the core untouched because he could not access it without me. When the manager finished, he looked up and asked if there was anything else I needed. I shook my head gently. "No, that will be all for now." For now? The word stayed with me as I walked back to my car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as I thought about everything that had led to this point. 35 years of marriage. Decades of building something together. Or at least, that was how I had always understood it. But now, looking back, I could see the shift more clearly. The small decisions I had handed over. The trust one had given without question. The quiet way I had stepped back, believing I was supporting us, when in reality, I had been removing myself from the very things I had created. And Robert had taken that space without hesitation. Not all at once. Not in a way that would have been obvious. But slowly, consistently, until he believed it all belonged to him. I started the car and drove home, the road familiar in a way that required no thought. When I pulled into the driveway, his car was already there. He had gotten home before me, which was unusual. I stepped inside and found him in the living room, sitting in his usual chair, the television on but muted. He looked up as I entered, his expression neutral, almost curious. "Where did you go?" he asked. It was a simple question, but there was something beneath it now, something I might not have noticed before. I set my keys down on the table and removed my coat slowly, giving myself a moment before answering. "Out," I said. He watched me for another second, then nodded and leaned back in his chair, as if that was enough. And maybe, for him, it was. But for me, everything had already changed. I moved through the house that evening the same way I always had, preparing dinner, setting the table, maintaining the routine that had defined our life for so long. But inside, there was no hesitation anymore. No uncertainty. Just a quiet, steady understanding of what needed to be done next. I was not going to confront him. Not yet. I was not going to argue or demand explanations. That was not how this would end. Instead, I would let him continue exactly as he was, confident, unaware, certain that everything was already his. And when the time came, when the moment was right, I would remind him of something he had clearly forgotten. Some things cannot be taken. They have to be given. And I had not given him anything. The following morning unfolded with the same quiet precision, but this time, every movement I made carried intention behind it. I woke before Robert, as I always did, and stood in the kitchen watching the sun rise over the backyard we had once planned together, back when the future felt shared instead of divided. I could still remember standing in that same spot years ago, holding blueprints in my hands, discussing where the garden would go, how wide the patio should be, what kind of stone would last through the winters. Those were not his ideas. They were mine, just like the early investments had been mine. The risks I had been willing to take when we had very little and even less certainty. I had believed in something he had only agreed to follow. And somewhere along the way, that belief had been rewritten into something else entirely. By the time Robert walked into the kitchen, adjusting the cuff of his shirt with that same practiced ease, I had already made breakfast. He sat down without a word, reaching for his coffee as if it had always simply appeared there. I watched him again, not with anger, but with clarity. It was strange how different everything looked once you stopped assuming the best in someone. "Big day coming up," he said casually, glancing at me over the rim of his cup. I nodded once. "It will be handled." He smiled at that, a small, satisfied expression that told me he believed the outcome was already decided. And in a way, he was right, just not in the way he expected. After he left for the day, I returned to the study and began organizing everything I had gathered. Not just the documents Daniel had sent, but the older records as well, the ones that told the Real story. The beginning, the foundation. I laid them out carefully, creating a timeline that stretched across decades, each piece fitting into the next with quiet precision. It was not just about proving what he had done. It was about showing what had always been true. Ownership is not just about names on paper. It is about who built something when there was nothing to build from. Around noon, I received another call from Daniel. This time, his tone was different. Not cautious, not measured. There was a quiet sense of confirmation in his voice. He told me he had reviewed the trust modifications again, along with the secondary accounts Robert had been using. There was a detail neither of us had focused on initially, something small enough to overlook if you were only looking at the surface. But it changed everything. One of the key transfers Robert had relied on had not been fully executed. It required a final authorization that had never been completed. My authorization. I did not speak right away. I let the weight of that settle, the simplicity of it almost surprising after everything else. "So it is not valid," I said finally. "Not without you," Daniel confirmed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of relief, but out of understanding. Robert had built his plan on the assumption that I would remain exactly who I had always been in his mind. Quiet, trusting, uninvolved. He had never considered the possibility that I might step back in, that I might look, that I might question. What happens if it is challenged? I asked. Daniel did not hesitate. It collapses. That word stayed with me long after the call ended. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because it was precise. Everything Robert believed he had secured depended on something he never actually had. And now, for the first time, I understood the full shape of what I was holding. That evening, when he returned home, he seemed lighter than usual. There was a confidence in the way he moved, in the way he set his briefcase down and loosened his tie, as if the outcome of the week ahead was already behind him. "We should probably talk about what comes next," he said, leaning against the doorway of the kitchen while I prepared dinner. I did not turn around immediately. I let a few seconds pass, letting him sit in the silence he had created. "There is nothing to discuss," I replied calmly. He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head slightly. "There is always something to discuss." I finally turned to face him, meeting his eyes with a steady expression he did not quite recognize. Not this time. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze, but then it passed just as quickly. He nodded once and walked away, as if the conversation had reached its natural end. But it had not. Not for me. Because while he believed we were approaching the conclusion of something, I knew we were only just reaching the part where everything he had built would begin to come apart. And I was ready to let it happen. By the time Thursday morning arrived, everything had already been decided, just not in the way Robert believed. I woke up before dawn, the house still wrapped in that quiet stillness that only exists before the day begins, and I moved through my routine with the same steady rhythm I had practiced for years. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy suit I had worn before, something understated, something that did not draw attention. There was no need for that. Not today. When I walked into the kitchen, Robert was already there, which was unusual. He stood by the counter, checking his watch, his movements sharper than usual, more deliberate. He looked up when I entered, studying me for a moment as if trying to read something that was no longer there. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded once. "I have been ready." He held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, as if satisfied with an answer he did not fully understand. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. He focused on the road, occasionally adjusting the radio, while I sat beside him with my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the passing streets without really seeing them. It felt familiar, this silence. But it was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had been left unsaid for years, everything that had slowly shifted between us until there was nothing left to recognize. When we arrived, he walked ahead of me, holding the door open in a gesture that might have once meant something. I stepped inside without hesitation, the cool air of the building settling around me as we moved toward the courtroom. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had days before. The same polished wood, the same quiet murmur of voices, the same sense that this was just another case, just another story passing through a system that had seen countless others before it. Robert took his seat beside his attorney, leaning in slightly as they exchanged a few final words. I remained still, my attention fixed forward, my expression calm. I did not look at him. Not yet. When the judge entered, the room shifted into order, voices fading into silence as everyone took their place. The proceedings began quickly, structured, predictable. Robert's attorney spoke with confidence, outlining their position with the same clarity and certainty he had displayed before. He spoke about shared efforts, joint decisions, equitable division. Words that sounded reasonable on the surface, but felt hollow once you understood what had been done behind them. I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly on the table in front of me. I did not react. I did not correct anything. I let every word settle into the room exactly as it was intended, because that was part of it. Letting him believe the narrative he had created was holding. Letting him feel the ground beneath him as solid as he thought it was. When my turn came, there was a brief pause, the kind that draws attention without effort. My attorney glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes, but I gave no signal beyond a small, almost imperceptible nod. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket as I did, and took a single step forward. "Your Honor," I began, my voice even, controlled, carrying just enough to be heard clearly without force. The judge looked at me, his expression neutral, patient. "Before we proceed further," I continued, "there is something I would like to submit for the record." I reached down and picked up the envelope I had placed beside me earlier that morning. It was plain, unmarked. Nothing about it suggested what it contained or what it meant. I held it carefully, not as a gesture, not as a performance, but simply as the next step in a process I had already completed in my mind. The courtroom remained quiet as I stepped forward and handed it to the clerk, who then passed it to the judge. Robert shifted slightly in his seat beside me. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I saw it. The first crack in the certainty he had carried so easily until now. I returned to my place without a word, folding my hands once again as I watched the judge open the envelope. There was no rush, no dramatic movement, just the quiet sound of paper being unfolded in a room that had suddenly become very still. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to look at Robert, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity, because in that moment, I knew something he did not. This was where everything he believed would finally be tested. And this time, I was not stepping back. The sound of paper unfolding carried further than it should have in a room that size, sharp and deliberate, like something being quietly undone. I watched the judge's hands as he lifted the first page, his expression unchanged at first, the same neutral focus he had maintained since the beginning of the hearing. Robert shifted again beside me, this time more noticeably, his fingers adjusting the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something solid. His attorney leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing just enough to signal attention, but not concern. Not yet. The judge read slowly, not skimming, not rushing, line by line, page by page. And as the seconds stretched into something longer, something heavier, the stillness in the room began to take on a different quality. It was no longer routine silence. It was waiting. I kept my posture steady, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my gaze directed forward, but I could feel the shift without needing to see it directly. The air had changed, subtly, but undeniably. After what felt like several minutes, the judge paused. Not dramatically, just enough to mark a transition. He adjusted the pages in his hand, aligning them carefully, then looked up for the first time since opening the envelope. His eyes moved across the room briefly before settling in our direction. "Mr. Collins," he said, his voice even measured. Robert straightened slightly, a reflex more than a choice. "Yes, Your Honor." There was a brief silence before the judge continued, not as a question, but as a statement. "These documents indicate that several of the asset transfers referenced in your claim were never fully executed." The words did not land all at once. They settled slowly, piece by piece, as their meaning became clear. I did not look at Robert immediately. I did not need to. I could feel the shift beside me, the slight tightening in his posture, the hesitation that had not been there before. His attorney spoke quickly, stepping in with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, I believe there may be some misunderstanding regarding the timing of those transactions." The judge did not interrupt him, but he did not respond immediately either. Instead, he returned his attention to the pages in front of him, turning to a specific section with quiet precision. "The authorization required for finalization," he said calmly, "appears to be incomplete. Specifically, the signature of Mrs. Collins." There it was. Clear. Undeniable. Not an argument. Not an interpretation. A fact. For the first time, Robert turned his head toward me. It was not a full movement, not an open confrontation, just enough to look, to confirm something he had not expected to question. I met his gaze briefly, my expression unchanged, offering him nothing to hold on to, nothing to challenge. Just the same calm presence he had relied on for years. The same silence he had mistaken for absence. His attorney continued speaking, adjusting his tone, shifting his approach, but the rhythm had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place was something more careful, more reactive. The judge listened, but his attention remained anchored to the documents, to the details that did not shift under pressure. After a moment, he set the papers down, his hand resting lightly on top of them as if marking their importance without needing to emphasize it. "Without proper authorization," he said, "these transfers cannot be considered valid in the context of this proceeding." Another pause followed, shorter this time, but no less significant. And then, something unexpected. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, a small movement that seemed almost casual, and let out a quiet, brief laugh. It was not loud, not mocking, just a simple reaction, the kind that comes when something becomes clear in a way that cannot be ignored. The sound lingered in the room, not because of its volume, but because of what it represented. A shift, a realization, a turning point that could not be reversed. I did not react. I did not allow myself even the smallest acknowledgement of what had just happened. Instead, I lowered my gaze slightly, returning to that same composed stillness I had carried with me from the beginning. Because this was never about a moment. It was about the entire structure that had led to it. And now, that structure was beginning to show its fractures. Slowly, quietly, exactly as I had intended. The moment the judge's laughter faded, it did not disappear completely. It lingered in the air like something unspoken but fully understood, and that was when everything began to shift in a way that no argument could reverse. Robert's attorney adjusted his posture, his earlier confidence now replaced with a sharper focus, the kind that comes when a situation no longer follows the expected path. He began speaking again, this time more carefully, choosing each word with precision as he attempted to redirect the narrative back into familiar ground. He spoke about intent, about ongoing processes, about documentation that could still be clarified. But the rhythm was gone. The certainty had fractured, and in its place was something else entirely. The judge listened, but his attention was no longer divided. It was anchored, not to the arguments, not to the performance, but to the facts that had already been placed in front of him. He tapped the stack of documents lightly with his fingers, not impatiently, just enough to signal where the focus remained. Intent does not replace authorization, he said calmly, his voice steady, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. Robert shifted again, this time unable to hide it completely. His hand moved across the table, then stopped, as if unsure where it was supposed to rest. He glanced at his attorney, searching for direction, for reassurance, for anything that could restore the structure he had walked into the room with. But there was none. Not anymore. I remained still, watching without watching, present without engaging, the same way I had been from the beginning. Because this was not the moment to speak. This was the moment to let everything unfold exactly as it needed to. The judge turned another page, slower this time, his eyes scanning a section he had already read once before, as if confirming something he already understood. Then he looked up again, his gaze moving directly to Robert. These accounts, he said, were altered in a way that suggests an attempt to reposition assets outside of the agreed framework. There was no accusation in his tone, no raised voice, just clarity, the kind that does not need emphasis. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately. For the first time, there was hesitation. Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. His attorney stepped in again, but the shift had already taken place. The foundation he had relied on was no longer stable, and every attempt to rebuild it felt thinner than the last. I allowed myself one small breath, slow and controlled, grounding myself in the moment without reacting to it. Because this was not about satisfaction. It was not about watching him lose. It was about something much simpler than that. It was about truth, placed quietly in front of a room that could no longer ignore it. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands coming together as he rested them on the desk. Given the inconsistencies presented here, he continued, this court will need to reassess the validity of the asset division being requested. The words settled with a finality that did not require repetition. Reassess, not consider, not review. Reassess. Everything that had been presented before was no longer sufficient. Everything would be examined again, this time with a different understanding, a different perspective, one that included what had been hidden until now. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer certain. He did not look at me this time. Not directly, but I could feel the awareness there, the quiet realization that something had slipped beyond his control. And still, I said nothing. I did not turn. I did not react. I did not offer him anything he could hold on to. Because this had never been about confrontation. It had never been about proving him wrong in a way that required words. It was about allowing him to reveal himself completely, in a space where nothing could be taken back once it was seen. The judge gathered the documents together again, aligning them with the same careful precision he had shown from the beginning. We will proceed accordingly, he said, his voice steady as he set the papers aside. And just like that, the direction of everything had changed. Not with noise, not with conflict, but with something far more powerful, quiet certainty. And I remained exactly where I had been from the start, calm, composed, and fully aware that the outcome he had walked in expecting no longer existed. The shift did not happen all at once, but it was undeniable once it began, like a structure quietly settling after the foundation beneath it has been disturbed. The judge's words still lingered in the room, not as an announcement, but as a quiet correction to everything that had been assumed before. Robert's attorney adjusted his approach again, his voice steady but noticeably more restrained now, as he attempted to reframe the situation with careful language. He spoke about technicalities, about timing, about the possibility that certain authorizations had simply been delayed, rather than intentionally omitted. But each sentence felt thinner than the last, as if it could not fully support the weight it was meant to carry. The judge listened without interruption, but his expression did not change. His attention remained anchored to the documents, to the details that did not shift no matter how they were presented. After a moment, he lifted one of the pages slightly, his eyes moving across a specific section before he spoke again. "There is also an additional matter here," he said, his tone calm but deliberate, as if introducing something that had already been established. The room seemed to settle further into silence, the kind that follows when something new is about to be revealed. I did not move. I did not react. I simply listened. These records indicate a pattern of transfers that extend beyond the accounts currently under discussion, the judge continued. Multiple transactions directed into entities that were not disclosed during the initial filing. This time, the words carried a different weight. Not just incomplete, not just invalid, hidden. Robert's attorney responded quickly, but there was a noticeable pause before he did, just enough to reveal that this was not something he had fully anticipated. "Your Honor, I would need to review those details further before making any statement," he said carefully. The judge nodded once, not dismissing the response, but not delaying his own conclusion either. "You will have that opportunity," he replied. However, the existence of these undisclosed movements raises significant concerns regarding the accuracy of the financial disclosures provided to this court. I felt the shift beside me again, stronger this time, more immediate. Robert leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer controlled, his attention fixed entirely on the judge now. There was no longer any attempt to appear unaffected, no effort to maintain the calm certainty he had carried into the room. It was gone, replaced by something else, something quieter, something closer to realization. I allowed myself a single glance in his direction, just enough to see what had changed. His expression was not one of panic. Not yet. It was something more subtle than that. A recognition. The moment when someone understands that the version of events they have relied on is no longer holding together. I returned my gaze forward without hesitation, my posture unchanged, my hands still resting calmly in front of me. Because this was not about watching him come apart. It was about allowing the truth to take its place without interference. The judge set the document back down with quiet precision, aligning it with the others before folding his hands together. "Given the scope of what has been presented," he said, "this court will require a full reevaluation of all asset movements and disclosures prior to making any determination regarding division." The words were measured, controlled, but their meaning was absolute. Everything would be examined again. Not just what had been claimed, not just what had been presented. Everything. Robert's attorney nodded, acknowledging the direction, but there was no longer any attempt to redirect the outcome. The path had already shifted. There was no returning to where it had been. I felt a quiet stillness settle inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just certainty. The kind that does not need to be expressed because it already exists. The kind that comes when something hidden is finally brought into the light, not by force, but by its own weight. The judge glanced once more at the documents, then toward both sides of the room, his gaze steady, his expression composed. "We will proceed accordingly," he said again, reinforcing what had already been established. And just like that, the structure Robert had built, piece by piece, began to give way. Not in a dramatic collapse, not in a sudden fall, but in something quieter, something far more final. It was no longer a question of whether his plan would succeed. It was a question of how much of it would remain once everything had been fully seen. And I remained exactly where I had been from the beginning, silent, steady, and fully aware that the outcome he had once been so certain of no longer belonged to him. The courtroom did not return to what it had been before, not after that moment, not after the shift had settled into every corner of the room with a quiet certainty that could not be undone. The judge remained still for a few seconds longer than expected, his fingers resting lightly against the documents as if measuring the weight of what had just been revealed. When he finally spoke again, his tone had not changed, but the direction had. It was no longer about listening. It was about deciding what came next. "Given the discrepancies identified," he said, "this court cannot proceed under the current assumptions presented by the petitioner." The words were measured, precise, and final in a way that did not require emphasis. Robert did not respond immediately. For the first time since this process began, he seemed to be searching for something to hold on to, something that would restore the structure he had walked in with. His attorney leaned closer to him, speaking quietly, but there was a noticeable urgency in the exchange, a shift from strategy to reaction. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my attention forward, allowing everything to unfold without interruption. Because this was no longer something that needed my voice. It was already moving on its own. The judge continued, his gaze returning briefly to the documents before lifting again. The validity of the requested division is now in question, pending a full review of all undisclosed transactions and incomplete authorizations. There was no hesitation in his delivery, no room left for interpretation. Everything that had been assumed was no longer certain. Everything would be examined again, this time without the foundation Robert had relied on. Robert finally spoke, his voice controlled but lacking the ease it had carried before. "Your Honor, I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, choosing his words carefully, as if precision alone could restore what had already begun to fall apart. The judge did not interrupt him, but when he responded, it was with the same calm clarity that had defined the entire proceeding. "If there is, it will be clarified through proper review," he said. "Until then, the court will proceed with caution." Caution. That word settled differently. It did not signal delay. It signaled scrutiny. Every detail, every movement, every decision would now be examined under a different lens, one that did not assume cooperation, but questioned it. Robert leaned back slightly, his posture no longer composed, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action required thought that had not been necessary before. He did not look at me, not once, and that, more than anything, told me he understood something had shifted beyond his control. His attorney attempted one final adjustment, presenting a refined argument, emphasizing procedural considerations, but it no longer carried the same weight. The structure beneath it had already been exposed, and no amount of language could rebuild it in that moment. The judge listened, then closed the folder in front of him with quiet finality. The sound was soft, but it marked the end of something that had begun long before we entered that room. "This matter will be continued," he said, his voice steady. "All relevant financial records are to be disclosed in full. Any further discrepancies will be addressed accordingly." The instructions were clear, direct, unavoidable. There was no longer any space for omission, no room for quiet adjustments or unseen transfers. Everything would be brought forward. Everything would be seen. I allowed myself a slow breath, steady and controlled, not out of relief, but out of recognition. This was the moment where everything changed. Not with confrontation, not with argument, but with something far more powerful. Exposure. Robert remained seated for a moment longer after the judge concluded, his hands resting on the table as if he had not yet decided what to do with them. His attorney gathered his papers quickly, speaking in a low voice, but Robert did not respond right away. When he finally stood, his movements were slower, less certain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not fully measure. I rose as well, smoothing the front of my jacket, my expression unchanged, my posture steady. I did not look at him. I did not need to, because everything that needed to be said had already been placed in front of him, not by me, but by the truth he had tried to move around so carefully. And now, there was nowhere left for it to hide. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different as soon as we stepped out. Not louder, not busier, just clearer, as if something that had been tightly contained inside that room had now followed us into the open. People moved past us, voices low, footsteps steady against the polished floor, but none of it reached me the way it might have before. I walked at my usual pace, neither fast nor slow, my posture straight, my hands relaxed at my sides, as if this were just another day, just another moment passing without significance. Behind me, I could hear Robert's footsteps, slightly uneven, not rushed, but no longer as measured as they had been earlier that morning. His attorney spoke quietly beside him, his tone controlled but firm, outlining what would need to happen next, what documents would need to be gathered, what responses would need to be prepared. It was all procedural, necessary, but it lacked the confidence it once carried. I reached the exit and stepped outside into the cool air, pausing for just a moment as the sunlight settled across my shoulders. It was not warm enough to be comforting, but it was steady, consistent, real. Something that did not shift depending on who was standing beside you. I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs fully before releasing it, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that had been building since the moment I answered Daniel's call. "Margaret," His voice came from behind me, closer now, more direct than it had been in days. I turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him without offering more than necessary. Robert stood a few feet away, his expression no longer composed, no longer certain. There was no anger in it, no raised voice, just something else. Something closer to confusion, to realization, to the understanding that the version of events he had relied on no longer existed. "What was that?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything he could not say directly. I looked at him for a moment, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just observing. The same way I had in the courtroom. The same way I had for longer than he realized. "It was what you missed," I said calmly. He frowned slightly, the words not landing the way he expected them to. "I do not understand," he replied, his voice quieter now, less certain. I held his gaze for a brief second longer, then shook my head gently. "That is exactly the problem." I turned back toward the parking lot and began walking again, not waiting for a response, not offering one. Because there was nothing left to explain. Not now. Not after everything had already been placed in front of him. He did not follow immediately. I could feel that. The pause behind me. The moment where he remained where he was, trying to piece together something that no longer fit the way it used to. And then, after a few seconds, his footsteps resumed, slower this time, more deliberate, as if each step required thought that had not been necessary before. When I reached my car, I unlocked the door and placed my bag inside before turning back briefly. He had stopped again, standing a short distance away, his posture uncertain, his hands resting at his sides without purpose. For the first time in years, he did not seem to know what to do next. And that, more than anything, confirmed what had already begun inside that courtroom. This was no longer his plan. This was no longer his control. I did not say anything else. I did not offer reassurance or explanation. I simply got into my car and closed the door, the sound soft but final in a way that did not need to be repeated. As I started the engine, I allowed myself one last glance in his direction, not out of hesitation, not out of regret, but out of clarity. Because the man standing there was not the one I had built a life with. He was someone else entirely. Someone who had believed that taking something quietly meant it belonged to him. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand the difference between taking and owning. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back again. The road ahead clear, steady, and entirely my own. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because everything else had. The road stretched ahead in a straight, familiar line. The same turns, the same traffic lights, the same quiet neighborhoods I had passed through for years without thinking. But this time, I noticed everything. The way the afternoon light settled across the pavement. The way the trees moved slightly in the breeze. The way the world continued exactly as it always had, untouched by what had just happened inside that courtroom. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it that morning, still, quiet, unchanged on the outside. I stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, my hand resting on the door before closing it, taking in the space in front of me with a clarity I had not felt in years. This had always been my home. Not because my name was on a document, not because of any legal structure, but because I had built it, piece by piece, decision by decision, long before Robert decided to treat it like something that could be divided. Inside, the air was cool and still. I set my keys down in the same place I always did, the soft sound echoing slightly in the quiet entryway. For a moment, I stood there without moving, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Everything was still here. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been lost. The illusion of it had simply been removed. I walked slowly through the house, past the living room, past the kitchen, letting my hand brush lightly against the edge of the counter as I passed. Each space held a memory, but for the first time, those memories felt separate from him. Separate from the version of the story I had been holding on to for so long. I moved into the study and sat down at the desk, the same desk where everything had begun to shift weeks earlier. The folder was still there, neatly arranged, every document exactly where I had placed it. I opened it once more, not because I needed to review it again, but because I wanted to see it clearly, without the weight it had carried before. Page after page, it told a story that no longer belonged to him. It never truly had. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it, allowing the silence of the room to settle around me. There was no urgency now. No need to act quickly or react at all. Everything that needed to be done had already been set in motion. The rest would follow in its own time. Later that evening, as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the floor, I stood by the window and looked out over the backyard. The garden was still there, just as I had designed it. The same arrangement of stone and space, the same careful balance I had once believed we had built together. But now, I saw it differently. Not as something shared, but as something I had created, something that remained steady even when everything else shifted. I did not think about what Robert would do next. I did not wonder how he would respond or what he might try to change. That was no longer my concern. Because for the first time in a long time, I understood something with complete certainty. I had never been the one standing on unstable ground. He had. I turned away from the window and walked back through the house, turning on a single light in the hallway as the evening settled in. The quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt earned. It felt like space that belonged entirely to me. And as I moved through it, I realized something else just as clearly. I had not fought him. I had not needed to. I had simply allowed him to follow his own plan to its natural end. And in doing so, he had shown exactly what he was willing to risk, exactly what he was willing to lose. I reached the end of the hallway and paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wall, grounding myself in the stillness of it all. Then I let it fall, turned, and continued forward without looking back. Because there was nothing left behind that I needed to return to, and everything ahead of me was finally, completely, my own.